Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Brad Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, about the future of the Axis of Authoritarians, the international rules-based order, and if the Trump administration is downplaying the threats posed by communist China. And then we break down the latest on U.S. Iran tensions, the death of the New START treaty, and a behind-the-scenes turf war over who's advocating for the U.S. Space Force. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent here at the Washington Times. I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Thanks to all of you for listening. I'm excited about this week's show because we have Brad Bowman from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies coming up in just a few minutes. And Brad is one of my favorite people to talk to about big picture geopolitics. And we get into a lot of those broad philosophical questions about the Trump administration's foreign policy approach and America's role in the world in the 21st century and a lot more. So stay tuned for that in just a few minutes. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be with you for another episode. The first thing I'm tracking is the expiration on February 5 of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as the New START Treaty. This was the last nuclear weapons transparency agreement between the U.S. and Russia. And the Trump administration, along with Vladimir Putin's government in Moscow, have decided not to re-up this treaty. It's a development that comes at a moment of rising U.S.-Russia tension overall. And really, more importantly, it comes against the backdrop of a Chinese nuclear arsenal that has grown rapidly in recent years. There are signals from President Trump's top advisors that there has been a pretty serious back-channel discussion with Russian officials about continuing to observe this New START treaty going forward, but nothing formal has come out on that as of taping this episode on the afternoon here on February 5. If something formal does come out of those back-channel discussions, it would have to be approved by both governments. So we're a little late to the game on this, Ben, and it's been a source of concern in national security circles in Washington for years, actually, and especially in recent months. We've been covering it very thoroughly at Threat Status. So we're going to continue to track that in the daily Threat Status newsletter. There's a couple of key factors in all this, Ben. One being President Trump's own threats in recent months to resume U.S. testing of nuclear weapons. He claims that Russia, China, and others are already doing that in ways that violate current international test ban agreements. Another thing here, Ben, is Vladimir Putin's threat repeatedly during the Ukraine war to deploy and use so-called tactical or smaller nuclear weapons. And then finally, there's this reality that the START treaty never had China as a party. And China has really emerged as having the fastest growing stockpile. There are estimates today that if you put the Chinese and Russian stockpiles together, they surpass the U.S. stockpile. Some have theorized that Russia and the U.S. both want to recreate some kind of a new nuclear arms treaty and have China at the table. Beijing has generally balked at that prospect. We're going to continue to watch this amid questions about the extent to which this is all contributing to the acceleration of a 21st century great power nuclear arms race, something that seems as absurd as it does obscene.
Yeah, I'm just curious because we had these talks between a U.S. delegation and Russian delegation in recent days in Abu Dhabi about the Russia-Ukraine war. I haven't gotten any indication that New START was among the topics that were being discussed. The Pentagon, just a couple hours before we recorded here on Thursday, February 5, put out a statement that said the U.S. and Russia have agreed to reopen a direct line of military to military communications that had been suspended since the fall of 2021, just a couple months before Russia invaded Ukraine. So it seems like they made some substantial progress, according to the Pentagon, on that issue, but there was no mention of New START and no mention of negotiations over any kind of treaty going forward. So I'm curious if that's even something that's on the radar of either delegation as these talks unfold.
It absolutely is on the radar, and there's not a lot of transparency around these talks. There aren't large delegations of members of the free press getting readouts in person and tracking the talks, and that's been a problem and a criticism. But I'll leave it at that. As far as back channel U.S. Russia comms, this makes me think of. I actually wrote about and I saw it in person, the so-called deconfliction phone line that the U.S. had set up at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar during the 2014 to 2017 height of the U.S. war against the Islamic State in the Middle East. There were major tensions at that time militarily between Russia and the U.S., particularly in Syria. I'm hopeful that the Trump administration could do something with regard to communications now with the Putin government to maybe reestablish nuclear deterrence treaties and include China in some kind of grand historic fashion. We'll see. Finally, Ben, on a separate front, I'm still closely watching the back and forth U.S. Iran tensions in the wake of the Iranian regime's massacre of thousands of protesters last month. Trump has sent the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group to the Arabian Sea. And there is still a kind of knife edge feel to the prospect that the president might suddenly order some sort of airstrikes against targets inside Iran. The strategic calculus on that is delicate. It's a fluid situation. Ben, recent days saw a U.S. fighter jet shoot down an Iranian drone that American military officials say aggressively approached the USS Abraham Lincoln. American forces also drove off Iranian boats harassing a U.S. flagged merchant ship in the Arabian Sea. Those incidents happened hours after Iranian leaders had signaled that they were willing to engage in new direct negotiations with Trump administration officials who've demanded that Tehran make major concessions on its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. As of taping this episode, U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner were slated to have a meeting Friday, February 6th, probably shortly after the episode comes out, with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Oman, that neutral Middle East sultanate. I personally am skeptical that much will come of this meeting. Sources are telling me that Kushner and Witkoff are hoping to convince the Iranian side to engage in a second round of higher profile nuclear talks after this. Again, we'll be tracking that in the days ahead in our daily threat status newsletter, Ben.
We've already mentioned Russia, China, and Iran. So I want to mention North Korea to kind of close out the Axis of Authoritarians here, because our friend of the show, Andrew Salmon, the Asia editor at the Washington Times, had a new report just this week about how North Korean troops are back in the fight alongside Russia against Ukraine. He reports that North Korean artillery units are operating howitzers and multiple launch rocket systems in Kursk and firing at the Ukrainians over the border and using aerial assets to spot the Ukrainian position. So North Korean troops, again, at war with Ukraine. That's an important development because it's that, example of that connective tissue between the Axis members that we always look for here in the show. I want to talk briefly about something else quickly before we get to Brad Bowman. That's an exclusive story that I had in the Washington Times this week that dove pretty deeply into what I think can be fairly described as a turf war between the Air and Space Forces Association and the Space Force Association. Listeners probably recognize the names of both of those organizations. They're both nonprofit 501c3 advocacy groups. We've had leaders from both AFA and SFA on the show. Threat Status has partnered with those groups and attended conferences that they both organized. But behind the scenes, there's, I think, what charitably could be called tension between them, and that's potentially a big deal. For listeners who don't know, the Air Force Association has existed for more than 75 years. The Space Force Association was founded just back in 2019, the same year the Space Force itself was founded as a U.S. military service. Essentially, SFA, the Space Force Association, advocates solely for the Space Force, not the Air Force, not for fighter jets and things like that, but just the Space Force, whereas AFA, the Air Force Association, advocates for both. And in 2022, rebranded itself as the Air and Space Forces Association in order to do that, to advocate for both space-based capabilities and things like fighter jet programs, Air Force modernization, and the like. So why does this matter? Why should anybody care? Well, there's a few reasons, I think. For starters, both of these organizations directly lobby lawmakers on things like military budgets and priorities. They each hold events that are meant to serve as a way for the Pentagon to communicate face-to-face directly with top defense companies. They both claim their events don't compete with each other, but in some ways, I think they kind of do. And more important than that, at least in my opinion, is the information space here. The Space Force Association recently launched its National Space Power Center, which we've talked about here on the show, essentially a think tank that it says will produce policy papers, research, tabletop exercises, war games related to space conflict, and do other things that Washington think tanks do. This is essentially their answer to the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, which has been around since 2013 and is affiliated with AFA. By the way, Mitchell has its own Space Power Advantage Center of Excellence, which is a think tank that already does a lot of the things that the National Space Power Center says it's going to do. Retired Air Force General David Deptula, the head of the Mitchell Institute, has been on this podcast and a trusted source of mine for years. But the point is, these two centers have already put out papers taking different positions on, for example, dynamic space operations. That refers to satellites and other systems able to maneuver, be serviced, refueled, make orbital changes, and take other steps that essentially make them dynamic in the space domain rather than stationary and limited to just one specific parameter. They seem to have different positions on exactly how heavily the U.S. Space Force and Congress should invest in that concept of dynamic space operations. So that could potentially be a big deal. They're going to have more disagreements, I would imagine, going forward. And so essentially what you've got now is two groups that could be at odds with each other in terms of what they're advocating for the Space Force to do and where they want lawmakers on Capitol Hill to direct money. Which side are they going to listen to if push comes to shove, as I think it inevitably will? So look, Guy and I both have good sources and people that we like, both in SFA and AFA. They should both succeed. They both do great work. And they both insist, I should say, in public statements that there's no animosity between them and that they can coexist. But, under the radar, this is the kind of thing that could become a real issue as the Space Force grows, and inevitably you have some pretty tough decisions that are going to have to be made financially in terms of what capabilities actually get funded in things like the National Defense Authorization Act. And we are joined now by Brad Bowman, the Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Hey, Brad, we've had a lot of people on this show with impressive resumes, but I think yours is up there with the best. U.S. Army officer, Black Hawk pilot, assistant professor at West Point, almost a decade working in the Senate, including work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and more. So we're pleased to have someone with your credentials on this show, Brad. It's a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
It's really a pleasure to be here. I respect both of you a ton and what you've done through the years, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So thank you.
Absolutely. There's a lot to get to. And Brad, you're, as we talked about before, one of my favorite sources to go to when I have these big picture questions about U.S. foreign policy or national security. So we're going to dive into a few of those. And for starters, I know right now you're working on some new research into the axis of aggressors or the axis of authoritarians, autocrats, tyranny, whatever. It's got a lot of names. But basically the group of adversaries generally defined as China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. we've had Cliff May, the founder and president of FDD, on this show last year, and he said that list should also include Venezuela and Cuba. But of course, that was before the U.S. raid last month that captured former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. So on the heels of that raid, and without asking you to spoil too much of the project you've got coming up here, what's the state of the Axis right now? Has it been fundamentally altered or weakened in some way by U.S. action in Venezuela? And do you think that other members of the Axis are kind of changing or recalculating the way they're thinking about military engagement or their own foreign policies as a result of what the U.S. did in Venezuela?
That's a great question. I think I'd need an hour to do it justice, but I'll try to give you the non-diatribe version. With your permission, let me zoom out even higher and then come back to the core of what you're asking, if that's all right. So yeah, we're doing a project. We're about 20 months or so into a project where we're looking at what we've called the Axis aggressors. We may have coined that term. I'm not sure. I'll take that credit maybe. And that includes China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And that you have all these other powers, middle or low weight powers kind of in their orbit, if you will, that you could debate should be included or not. But what I think is unique about our project at FDD is that we're not just looking at one or two adversaries, we're looking at four. I'm no mathematician, but that's 6 bilateral relationships, right? 4 adversaries, 6 bilateral relationships. And we're not just looking at it through a military lens. We're looking at it through our Center on Military and Political Power, the one I lead, H.R. McMaster is our chair. Our Center on Economic and Financial Power, so we're looking at it through an economic lens as well. And our Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, led by the great Mark Montgomery. So 4 adversaries, 6 bilateral relations through the lenses of at least 3 different domains. Why? For what purpose? Because we're masochists? Well, maybe, but also because if you're going to do strategy, right, you not just need to be coordinating ends and means, which is easier said than done, but you need to understand the most likely and most dangerous threats to the protection of those interests to inform the allocation of that sounds very wonky, but that's strategy. So I'm kind of with the National Defense Strategy Commission a year ago this summer, who said we're in the most dangerous geostrategic moment we've seen as Americans since 1945. I agree with them. And one of the reasons why it's so dangerous, not the only, but one of the reasons is because our adversaries, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified last summer, are engaging in extraordinary cooperation with one another across all domains. Now, listeners will say, oh, you're hyping the threat, or others will say, oh, you're underestimating the threat. I don't want to do either, right? You say, okay, Axis, you hear the word Axis, you think George W. Bush, Axis of Evil, you're hyping it. Okay, we can talk about that. And then other people think of the 20th century Axis. I got to tell you right now, bottom line up front, what we're seeing from this 21st century Axis makes the Axis of the 20th century look like JV kiddie playland. Okay, I'll just say that. And just in CMPP alone, my center alone, we've identified 5 areas of security cooperation: arms development, arms transfers, military exercise, intel sharing, and military exchanges / diplomacy. We define each of those in excruciating detail. We've documented from 2019 to 2025, December 31st, 2025, that's when we stopped our collection, over 600 instances of cooperation across these 5 categories of cooperation. Some scary, some not, but when you put them all in the pot and stir, this is increasing the capability, military capability, capacity, readiness, and resilience of each of these adversaries, making each of them more formidable than they would have been otherwise in their ongoing or prospective spheres of aggression. And I'll end with this, underscoring what the Trump administration said in its national defense strategy that it released recently, that we face the danger of simultaneous conflicts, if not them fighting together. I never got to Venezuela, but I can do that if you want.
That's okay. I want to drill into, so you mentioned the NDS, and you and Mark Montgomery did a pretty good in-depth explainer that I relied on, that laid out some of the strengths and weaknesses as you see them about the NDS. But I want to drill into what you said about China. You said parts of the NDS are wildly insufficient, quote unquote, as a response to Beijing, particularly because the U.S., the NDS strategy doesn't explicitly describe how the U.S. would support Taiwan, and ignored some of China's ongoing cyber aggression against American infrastructure, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But I kind of get the sense we're getting a little bit of mixed messages when it comes to how the U.S. views China and the big picture threat that it poses to the international order, and specifically to the U.S. and its allies. Are we kind of in the midst of a major strategic long-term error, Brad, or is the document the NDS just end up in a drawer somewhere and we forget about what it says, 3 months from now? Or is there a shift in strategic thinking happening right now that you think could be dangerous?
Bottom line up front, I think we're in the midst of one of the most consequential transformations in U.S. foreign policy in years, if not decades. Full stop. I've been doing this for a while. All of us have. I have not seen anything like what we're experiencing right now. This, I think, it's always dangerous to make predictions. I try to not to be in the prediction business, but I predict if we're reading a history book 10, 15, 50 years from now, we're going to look back on this period as a pivot, as a transformative and consequential moment. The national security strategy, which is, of course, required by law and is the umbrella strategic document that informed the national defense strategy and then the subsequent global posture review, they codify and help herald this transformation. And more than most, they kind of reflect more or less what this administration is doing. Now, I grant you, Donald Trump, he'll say one thing today and do something tomorrow, and that kind of makes strategy hard. But, the vast majority of decisions, as we know, don't go to the NSC or the White House. They're made down in the cabinets and in the services and in the combatant commands. And so this is the strategic guidance. And so I think those who would want to dismiss these documents don't really understand the way things work, even though we're dealing with a mercurial president. So very quickly, there's a lot to like in the National Defense Strategy. If you have insomnia tonight, you can read our piece with Mark Montgomery in Real Clear Defense. There's earmarks of a serious strategic effort. I think coordination ends ways and means. I like the focus on the industrial base, echoing what we wrote in our Arsenal of Democracy monograph in April 2025. I like the focus on homeland defense and nuclear deterrence. They warned about simultaneous conflicts. I agree with them on burden sharing as a concern if the strategy is coordinate ends and means, but how they've gone about it has often been counterproductive and foolish. And I agree with them that Israel is a model ally and we need more allies like Israel. But and then we have a list of things we don't like. You asked about China. Very quickly, with a full hat tip to my colleague Mark Montgomery, who's really done a lot of major work on this. As you'd expect by a document shaped by Bridge Colby, there's some goodness. He sent some goodness on strategy of denial, first island chain stuff. But what the blank, they don't even mention Taiwan once. How in the National Defense Strategy do not mention Taiwan once? Well, I have it word that a particular cabinet secretary edited it and may have taken out any reference to Taiwan for fear of provoking China. That's not a good sign. And all the focus is on the first island chain. But what about the ongoing cyber and information warfare campaign that China is doing as we speak right now against Americans that have been for decades, including, and I'll end with this, planting things in our infrastructure, both military and especially civilian, that's going to make it more difficult for the United States to flow tens of thousands of service members and equipment from, Arkansas to the first island chain in time to deter and defeat aggression. And so they're points for first island chain, as you'd expect from a Bridge Colby influenced document. But holy cow, they're almost completely silent on the cyber warfare and information warfare. And by the way, we've dismantled our nation's ability, more or less, to go on the offensive in information warfare campaign. And I think that's unwise because I think it leaves Beijing with the impression that they might be able to pursue their political objectives in the Pacific, namely with Taiwan, at an acceptable cost, because what they're doing in our homeland will prevent us from getting sufficient forces there in time to present some sort of fait accompli or impose a cost on them that will make them think twice.
Brad, that's very interesting. You just said that the U.S. has dismantled its ability to go on the offensive in cyber and information warfare campaigns. Say more. What are you talking about? The end of the Global Engagement Center? Are you talking about
That's one of them. That's one of them.
With clandestine contracting with offensive cyber company. Where did that statement come from?
Yeah, thank you. I know it sounded a little Hallmark cardy and flippant, but there's actually hopefully some meat behind it. I was honored to edit a major FDD monograph called Cognitive Combat. Your listeners can look it up, Cognitive Combat. And we had sections there on China, Russia, and Iran. I wrote the introduction and conclusion. And when I was going about that, the first task I had was to define information warfare, because if you ask 3 people, you get 5 different definitions on information warfare. The DoD defines it as like everything, including underwater basket weaving. It's so broad. It's
Total. I studied it, and the informational instrument of power, right? It's a broad one. It's in the
it includes what I had for breakfast. I mean, sometimes if you make it so broad, it's ridiculous. And then at sometimes it's so narrow that you're talking about, well, I got to protect my computer system from hacking. And it's so narrow. So I went ahead and defined it. I don't have the definition memorized. You'll see it there. But here's the takeaway for, people who don't do this for a living, taking notes at home. We are currently at war with China, Russia, Iran in the information domain. They are waging war against us, and their primary objectives are, of course, as autocrats, to retain their number one audience is their own people, because they're autocrats and they want to retain their grip on power. Their number 2 target, that might surprise Americans, is us. Why? Because of our power and our example, and they want to make us as dysfunctional, as basket case as possible. They want to convince Republicans that Democrats and Republicans are evil, so we're at each other's throats. So we're such a basket case that we don't look like something that anyone would want, and that their authoritarian model looks better, and that we don't have the ability or the will to project power to defend our interests abroad. And finally, they want to dupe us about our true interests in the outcomes in Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, to make us believe that what happens there doesn't matter.
The U.S. has dismantled its ability to go on its own.
Yeah. So I'm talking about the Global Engagement Center, which, anyone who knows anything about that say, Brad, what are you talking about? That thing was a shadow of what it should have been. It had all kinds of problems. But the point is, like if one considers themselves a conservative, right? We know that as philosophers said, it's easier to destroy than it is to build. So, if you got a problem with an institution, right, before you destroy it, maybe you should reform it. So, if you're buying what I'm pitching, and if you don't buy it, read the kind of combat monograph, that we're under attack, then, we need to shift the cost benefit analysis of those attacking us. And one of the ways you do that is by going on the offensive. But we don't want to go on the offensive. Both Republicans and Democrats don't want to go on the offensive. Why? Wait for it. Because we don't want to provoke our adversaries. But that's crazy.
Brad, real quick, I know Guy has another question here, but since you brought this up, I want to jump to this, because we're talking about, Chinese potential cyber operations, ways to potentially cripple America's ability to move military equipment around this country and essentially abroad. What's your view on what the threshold should be of when that kind of operation warrants a kinetic military response?
It's a great question. People have been asking that some form of that genius question for a long time. I won't pretend here in 30 seconds to have a perfect answer, but there's been and again, with the full respect to my colleagues over in the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, Annie Fixler and Mark Montgomery, in the cyber domain you have attribution issues, right, and you have threshold issues, right, and what you just asked is a threshold issue. At what point is activity in the cyber domain warrant, necessitate, legitimize activity in the kinetic domain? I love the wisdom behind it, because it's an asymmetrical strategy you're implicitly suggesting, that just because someone is attacking us with one tool doesn't mean we have to respond with that tool. And that is why what we're doing with our Axis analysis is so important. Those who want to diminish or dismiss or shrug at what I'm saying, warning about the Axis, will say, well, so this country sent that, but they're not sending it back. Well, right, because you're not looking in the economic and the cyber domain. So they might send weapons, and the payback may not be weapons. It might be in another domain. That's why if you're doing a unidomain analysis, you're going to miss something. So yes, some cyber attacks are so severe that they might require a kinetic response, for sure. But at a minimum, I would say, let's have at least a strategy of reciprocation. If you're doing this to us in our cyber domain, you better count on it, Beijing. We're going to do it to you. And if you don't like that, maybe you should stop.
Brad, I actually want to step out a little bit, because I feel like we miss something if we don't get in some kind of a look at the Trumpian spheres of influence dogma that everybody talks about these days in the national security community. Big question, is the U.S.-led post-World War II international order still viable in the form that we've known it? Should Washington be fighting to maintain that international order? and all the financial and human costs that go with it? Or does the U.S. need to just really shift its thinking about allies and partners 100%, whether we're talking about strong arming European allies and Asian allies into spending more on defense, or relying on Israel or Turkey and others to do the heavy lifting in the Middle East? What's your thinking?
Thank you. What a question. I'll try. I heard four main themes: the rules-based international order. I got to say something about tone, allies and partners, and spheres, and I'll try to do it. 4 minutes or less? Does that work? So here we go. Rules-based international order. So that has become evidently in some segments of the political right in this country a four-letter word. When we say rules-based international order, I mean, everyone has a different definition, but what do I mean? I mean freedom of navigation, the ability to sail where international law, I just said it, international law, sail where international law permits. Why might that matter to the United States? Oh, I don't know. We're a maritime power and a trading power, and 95% of consumers are outside the United States, and our prosperity, security depend on our ability to do that. Oh, that's good. Okay, freedom of navigation, I like that. What else is a common sense centrist definition of rules? Oh, I don't know. Respect for borders, territorial integrity, national sovereignty. Oh, that sounds downright conservative. That served us pretty well. So depending how you define rules-based international order, respectfully, Secretary Hegg...
Maintenance of the dollar as the primary U.S. currency in world markets.
Yeah. You'll notice I'm focusing on... Thank you. And so if you read Secretary Hegseth, I told you I liked a lot about the National Defense Strategy. One thing I didn't like in his memorandum introducing it, he talked about cloud castle abstractions like the rules-based international order. Excuse me? Okay, so here's my prediction. Second prediction of the podcast. If America does not defend the rules-based international order, it will go away, and our children and grandchildren will wish we hadn't done that. There's my prediction. And when I'm an old man or in the grave, come back and check me on that. I think I'm going to be right on that one. So
can you project a spheres of influence foreign policy dogma and protect the rules-based international order?
Well, I got a beef for the spheres of influence thing. I was going to go there. I'll go there now. So if by spheres of influence we mean that America has ignored the Western Hemisphere too long, we have not allocated additional resources, that China, Russia, and Iran are doing things in Latin America we don't like, see my podcast with General Richardson, she was Southcom commander. See my event with General Richardson. General Richardson's on my board. I get it. We've been warning about Chinese. Yes. If that's what we mean, spend more resources in...
You're talking about Laura Richardson.
I'm talking about General Laura Richardson, the former commander of U.S. Southern Command, who's 100%. A national treasure and great, and has been warning about this stuff for years. So none of this is new. That's what I'm saying. So if we're saying we're going to spend more resources in the Western Hemisphere, count me in. But if you're going to try to solve everything with blowing things up, then you're simply going to play right into the hands of our adversaries, create more opportunities for them, and you will not solve the problem, because most of the problems in Latin America are not military in nature and will not be solved by blowing things up. And you'll simply consume finite resources like, the Ford Carrier Strike Group that was in the Adriatic that would have been in Central Command. And because it's in the Caribbean, and rather than the Adriatic or Central Command, we're pulling the Abraham Lincoln out of the Pacific. Where's Bridge Colby when you need him? We're pulling the Abraham Lincoln out of the South China Sea. So last comment on spheres of influence. Do more to protect our neighborhood, yes. But if we start to sound rapacious, if we Greenland, if you start to steal things that are not yours, then you start to sound like Putin. And one of the reasons I enjoy my profession, that I'm a proud American patriot, is because we're not only strong, but more importantly, we're good. And we will cease to be good if we become like Vladimir Putin and pursue a policy of might makes right. And a spheres of influence strategy is going to be some form of retreat if done incorrectly. So more in the neighborhood, yes. Don't be like Putin, and be careful where you withdraw from, because if you withdraw from something, you can get wars you could have prevented otherwise. That doesn't mean we need hundreds of thousands of more troops in Eastern Europe, but anyone who's been in the Army or the Marine Corps knows what a economy of force mission and a secondary mission is, that if you don't get the secondary mission right, it'll undermine your main mission, aka China.
Well, Brad, we could go on for hours probably on these questions, and we'll have to have you back to continue this conversation, but this was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week. our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you listen to the show. Guy, what do you have as your threat of the week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that critical U.S. alliances have become weaker around the world, specifically with European allies and Asian allies, at a moment when many agree that Washington is in the midst of a new global Cold War with China and Russia. Whether you blame Trump administration policy for this weakening or not, I mean, meaning you're worried that Trump is overly demanding on issues like Greenland, or overly demanding that Europe spend more on its own defense, or that Asian allies like South Korea and Japan do the same, or that Trump has created ill will among allies with tariffs. Really, regardless, the point is that there are some smart thought leaders out there warning about the dangers of a weakening global alliance network at this kind of Cold War moment as authoritarian regimes coalesce, something that was evidenced in recent days by a very warm video call between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping that got very little coverage in the English language media space. My threat of the week is that those relationships are growing stronger while the U.S.-led network of alliances is weakening.
Absolutely right. And that has impacts that sometimes you can't even really foresee years and even decades down the road. My threat of the week is the control that companies and billionaires have over military operations around the world. I talked recently on the show about how the Space Force, for example, relies heavily on commercial assets in space for data, imagery, and other things. And that's a trend that's only going to continue. And Guy, you highlighted in the Threat Status newsletter today about how Russian troops have lost access to Starlink internet terminals as Ukraine and SpaceX, which operates those terminals, coordinate to essentially disrupt what Moscow is able to do on the front lines of the war. In other words, SpaceX and its CEO, Elon Musk, made a decision to try to cut that Russian access. So I guess in this specific instance, that's a good thing. But what about if it's not a good thing in the other examples in the future? We're entering a world, or I guess we're already there, in which people like Musk can directly impact military operations and what militaries are able to do. I don't want to sound too cynical here, but it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to imagine a world in which U.S. companies could, for their own political or personal, or I guess as they would see it, even moral reasons, that they don't approve of a U.S. military action, for example, drug boat strikes. Could that company then say, we're not going to provide whatever data the U.S. military relies on to conduct some of those operations via satellites or other means? What about if private companies become crucial components of the Golden Dome missile shield, but decide that for whatever reason, they feel that the Golden Dome is contributing to major conflicts or increasing the chances of a major war? Could they then shut down their assets that are part of that project? There are a lot of other examples, and we'll talk more about them, I'm sure, going forward on the show. But for now, it's my threat of the week because we just got another reminder that private companies and billionaires increasingly have direct control over assets that militaries need, including the U.S. And I think the more vulnerable the U.S. is to the whims and personal feelings of those people and those companies, that could be dangerous moving forward. And with that, thanks, Guy, for being here again. A huge thanks to Brad Bowman from FDD for that really great and fascinating interview. And most of all, of course, a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.